Ayes have it. The ayes have it. Senator Lyons.
Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, President, I seek leave to take note of Minister for Education Mr Pyne's response to Senate resolutions.
Is leave granted? There being no objection, leave is granted. Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I've just had a look at the response from Minister for Education Mr Pyne, and I have to say it is a bitter disappointment. It's a bitter disappointment, particularly from the government, who before the election committed to Australian students and indeed Australian parents and the Australian community that it was on a unity ticket on Gonski. And we know that Gonski is about providing equal opportunity in our schools. It's a new funding model which, for the first time in Australia's history, will address disadvantage and will address different outcomes, because as a modern society, as a society that prides itself on education, we cannot allow postcodes to keep determining student outcomes in Australia. That's the wrong approach. And judging by Minister Pyne's response this evening, I'd have to say it seems to continue along that way. Because what Minister Pyne wants to focus on, teacher quality, principal autonomy, engaging parents in education and strengthening the curriculum. All of this has been revisited before, and the opportunity to really address the funding inequities in our school system across all sectors of schools, public and private, seems to have disappeared. That unity ticket on Gonski is now a former shadow of itself, and who knows what we might expect in the budget that's going to be announced in a couple of hours. And it's not as if we don't know what's happening with education in Australia. The pointers are there. We have the Australian Early Development Index, an index that goes across 5-year-olds, and it looks at 5 domains to look at how ready our 5-year-olds are for learning. It looks at their physical health and well-being, their social competence, their language development, and their communication skills. And guess what? Most Australian students are doing reasonably well on those measures. But when you look at the children that are developmentally delayed on those measures, 22% of our 5-year-olds. Now, these are children for who they're just starting school. They're ready, they're eager to learn. They're the students we should be focused on. Yet 22% of 5-year-olds in Australia are developmentally vulnerable on one or more of those domains, And more than 10% of Australia's children are developmentally vulnerable on 2 or more of those domains. These are 5-year-old children at the start of their formal school-based learning. And when we look at Aboriginal children, they are twice as likely to be developmentally vulnerable on those indexes, twice as likely. And what Gonski was designed to do was to address that inequality, right at the beginning of our child's schooling, because we know all the academic research tells us that brain development is done in the early years, 5's, quite frankly, a little bit late, but not beyond fixing. And yet we now have a government, sadly, who's not funded, who's not even focused on trying to address that sort of inequality. Gonski told us that a significant number of 15-year-olds are leaving school barely able to read, not literate to be able to effectively operate in our community. And no wonder, when we look at that 5-year-old index, we've got 5-year-olds we can measure that we know are already failing before they start the school system. And Gonski would have addressed that. But no, the government wants to commit itself to independent schools, basing it on a Western Australian model. I can tell you, as a Western Australia senator, there's no academic research that tells us that independent schools do any better than any other school, and yet this is a plank the Abbott government is hanging its hat on. I mean, the life of our school students should not be something that's gambled on. We've got quality research that tells us we need to do more for our 5-year-olds. We've got Gonski, which tells us that postcodes are defining academic outcomes. And yet this government is completely ignoring that, trying to reinvent schooling all over again, and all it's doing is committing another generation, significant numbers of Australian students, to failure. Because by the time children are 10, Mr Acting Deputy President, they know they're failing in our system. So we've got an index that tells us 5-year-olds are missing out. By the time they are 10, they know they're missing out. And we all know from Gonski that we've got 15-year-olds who are not literate. That's a shame. It's a disgrace. And all of us, no matter which political party we come from, should be wanting to do something about that. But no. The Abbott government is going to focus on making schools independent, and there's no proven academic research that tells us that does any good to our students. So it is very disappointing to see the response from Senator Pyne. It's very disappointing and, quite frankly, dishonest to commit to the Australian public the unity ticket on Gonski, to find that that's now gone, and goodness knows what our budget is going to do. All I can implore in this chamber is it would be a travesty to follow the West Australian model on education. Western Australia is not a leader in education by any stretch of the imagination, and it's a shame that Senator Pyne's response doesn't address equity at all. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker.